could do that item.
When I told Bonnie this morning, she asked, I mentioned that we'd probably record it, and she said some people had asked for it.
Great. That's great. Thank you, Pam. I'm glad you thought of that.
Sure.
Anyway, we'll start with a brief part of the film, and then we'll open up for our panel, and I'll have a few prepared questions for them. And then, as Sue Ellen said, we'll do Q&A. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Nicole Gardner. I'm on the steering committee of Watertown Citizens for Peace, Justice, and the Environment. I'm also the counselor for District A, Watertown. If any of you are Watertownians, or even if not, whether you're in District A or not, if you'd like to join my counselor newsletter, please let me know with a quick drop in the chat, and I'll be sure to add you. That's my pitch for tonight. So let me, with that, turn over. I really believe in information as a way to empower and engage residents. So I really hope you all sign up and then get your neighbors to do so as well. Turning on though to our program for tonight, I'm just going to introduce our panelists. I wonder if we should do that before we do the film. I hadn't thought about it. I think we'll do the intros and then we'll do the film. So I'll start with Bonnie. Bonnie Waltch is a producer, director, and writer of documentaries and a museum exhibit media. Most recently, Bonnie produced and wrote the 1-hour international television documentary, Earth Emergency, and series of 5 short films, Climate Emergency, Feedback Loops. Other recent work includes exhibit media for the Pikes Peak Visitor Center, the Tennessee State Museum, and the National World War II Museum, among others. Her broadcast work includes producing for NOAA BBC, Scientific American Frontiers, and the Discovery Channel. Bonnie's lived in Watertown for 27 years. Welcome, Bonnie. Brian Hebesian is a member of the Watertown Environment and Energy Efficiency Committee, affectionately called Watertown WE3C, and Watertown Faces Climate Change, a working group of Watertown Citizens for Peace, Justice, and the Environment. And by the way, WFCC is also a Watertown node of 350 Mass. Brian's been active in the effort to make our schools net zero energy and the Climate Action Plan. And most intriguing to me of all personally, Brian has an almost all electric house from renewable energy. So I'll be bugging you with questions about that at the end of the program, Brian. Lastly, Representative Steve Owens serves as the state rep for the 29th Middlesex District, which is most of Watertown and parts of North and West Cambridge. He's currently in his first term and serves on the House Global Warming and Climate Change Committee, as well as the joint committees on telecommunications, utilities, and energy, and financial services. Prior to his election, he was the chair of the Watertown Democratic Town Committee for 12 years and worked professionally as a transportation consultant, focusing on freight, logistics, and supply chain data. In the State House, Steve's priorities are reducing the impact of climate change and ensuring an equitable, green, and clean recovery. So welcome, Steve. Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us. And with that, we'll turn it over to Bonnie to air the segment.
Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. I just want to say that this is one of 5 short films we have up on a website for free, totally accessible to teachers, people in the community who might want to view them and use them. And we also have discussion guides up on our website, as well as a grades 6 through 12 curriculum for teachers. So this film is called Permafrost, and I'm going to share my screen. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. So is there a way to let me share the screen?
So
it worked when Pam and I tried it out this morning.
Okay, I think you're now.
You'll be able to do it now.
Okay, great. There we go. So let me make sure I can play this. Okay.
In the Northern Hemisphere, nearly 1/4 of the land is covered by an icy expanse called permafrost. Extending from the surface down thousands of feet, its soil contains billions of tons of carbon-rich plant and animal remains suspended in a perpetually frozen state. But now, with human activity warming the Arctic 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the globe, this permafrost is starting to thaw. And alarmingly, it contains twice as much carbon as in the atmosphere today, and 3 times as much as in all the world's forests combined. As it thaws, microscopic animals called microbes that have been frozen for up to tens of thousands of years are waking up and feeding on the newly thawed carbon remains, emitting dangerous heat-trapping gases.
If we were to take all of the microbes on Earth, we'd find that they'd weigh probably 50 times more than all of the animals on Earth. Now, these microbes need to eat, and what they eat are the dead remains of plants and animals. And as a byproduct of feeding on that material, they produce carbon dioxide and methane.
To understand how warming temperatures accelerate microbial activity, you need to look no further than your own kitchen.
It's like having a chicken in your freezer. You take the chicken out, you put it on the counter, and it starts to thaw. And then you go away for the weekend, you forgot about the chicken that's on the counter, and you come back and the house smells and chicken's decomposed. That's what happens to the carbon that's in permafrost. It's fuel for microbes. As they're breaking it down and using that fuel, they're releasing greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere.
Driven by fossil fuel emissions raising the temperature in the Arctic, these microbes are amplifying the warming as the permafrost thaws by releasing more carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere and warming the climate even more in a self-perpetuating loop. Which of these heat-trapping gases is released depends on the environment in which microbes digest the carbon. In oxygen-rich conditions like soil and lake surfaces, microbes produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct. But in environments lacking oxygen, like bogs and muddy lake bottoms, they produce methane, which is nearly 30 times more potent at trapping heat than carbon dioxide. Scientists predict the impact of both methane and CO2 added to the atmosphere from permafrost thaw will be staggering.
The amount of carbon that could be released from thawing permafrost by the end of this century has been estimated to be up to 150 billion tons of carbon. So to put that in context, the US is currently the second largest greenhouse gas emitting country in the world. If we took our current US emissions and added that up through 2100, this is on par with the amount of carbon that might be released from thawing permafrost.
Last summer, while working in her usual field location in Alaska, Natalie witnessed a remarkable acceleration of permafrost melting.
First of all, it was very, very warm. It was 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the tundra. There were places where we walked where my foot fell into the ground because there was no longer any ground structure because the permafrost was thawing. I've never seen change happening that quickly from one year to the next.
To understand how this thawing will impact the global climate, Natalie and her team collect permafrost cores from different locations across the Arctic. In the lab, she analyzes their carbon content and composition to determine how much gas will be released when the permafrost thaws.
These cores were taken from a location that has really organic, rich, deep, peaty soils. And you can tell that when you look at this core because it's really dark brown, and that dark brown color means that it holds a lot of carbon.
The thawing permafrost not only impacts the climate through the release of greenhouse gases, it can entirely transform the landscape, as Natalie has seen in Duvany Yar, Russia.
I had never seen permafrost thaw, ground collapse of that magnitude. I remember driving up to it on the boat, and it was like, wow, this huge cliff, many, many stories high. You see these really, really fine roots that have been frozen for 40,000 years. Once they're thawed, they'll decompose in a year.
And something else is having a dramatic effect on the landscape in Siberia. Crater-like holes, which are thought to be the result of a buildup of methane under a thick layer of ice. When the ice melts, the pressure gives way, causing an explosion.
Whoa.
A year or two later, the craters form lakes that release the previously buried methane into the atmosphere.
Hi, hon.
Sometimes lakes that form from shifts in the landscape emit so much methane, you can light them on fire.
Hmm.
As the permafrost thaws and the Arctic heats up faster than the rest of the planet, that blanket of warming mixes into the atmosphere, encircles the globe, and it leads to all kinds of global disasters. Crop failure in the Midwest, droughts and flooding in Africa, record heat waves in India. And in the Northern Hemisphere, home to most of the world's lakes, the warming is having an impact similar to the permafrost thaw by bringing new food sources to the microbes that live there. Plant species from south of this region are migrating north, setting off another feedback loop.
Traditionally, the pine needles that the microbes would be digesting would have provided quite a limited diversity of food sources. But now with deciduous broadleaf species like maple and oak, that's bringing a much greater diversity of organic matter and carbon for microbes to digest.
More food choices means an increase in microbial activity, which in muddy lake bottoms lacking oxygen leads to methane production, a warmer climate, and more greening of lakes in an ever amplifying loop. And the geographical range where this dynamic is happening is expanding.
That northward shift isn't just happening at northern latitudes where most of the world's lakes are found, but also elsewhere like New England, like the Great Lakes area.
Deciduous trees aren't the only species drawn to the warmer climate.
Another major change that we're seeing happening around lakes is that cattails are moving northwards into the lakes where they previously didn't grow, and where we compared the effect of cattails versus pines and oaks and maples on the amount of methane released from lake sediments. What we found was that there was at least 400 times more methane produced when we added the cattail litter than any of the tree litter.
Models show that in the next 50 years, cattails around lakes will double. And since more cattails means more methane, methane production is predicted to increase by 70% across all northern lakes.
From the global climate perspective, this is something that we really need to be worrying about and thinking about how to actually mitigate and offset.
And the problem is only going to get worse as the amount of heat trapping gases microbes produce increases. Today we have a choice. We can continue with business as usual and let these warming feedback loops spin out of control. Or we can choose another way of living. We can implement policies that support a sustainable future. We can curb fossil fuel use and regreen the earth. This would slow down and eventually reverse the feedback loops to restore the planet. For permafrost, the less warming we create, the less carbon dioxide and methane will be released into the atmosphere. The more temperatures will drop and the more permafrost will stay frozen.
Once carbon is emitted from permafrost, it will take a very long time for it to build back up. There are some places where the physical effects of permafrost thaw may be permanent, but in other cases, when you're having permafrost thaw, you can have permafrost refreeze.
Since greenhouse gases mix throughout the global atmosphere, action everywhere in the world will reduce permafrost thaw. And reduced permafrost thaw will decrease warming everywhere in the world.
Communicating with our policymakers that this is important to us, that this is impacting each one of us, that this is important for human health, for human well-being, is the most important action that each one of us can take.
to successfully address climate change requires unprecedented level of societal cooperation across nations, cooperation within nations, across multiple sectors. And that could happen. It does require leadership. Ideally, what science can do for us in this conversation is illustrate different possible futures.
Thanks for running that for us, Bonnie, and welcome back, everybody. So, Bonnie, I think we're going to start with you. And I know you mentioned at the beginning there are actually 5 short films. So we've seen the permafrost film. Where else are we seeing climate feedback loops?
Yeah, so in the series of 5 films, we talked about about a dozen different feedback loops. And we're seeing them in forests as trees are burned by forest fires and the climate makes them more susceptible to insects and drought, and deforestation reduces the number of trees. So we're seeing them there. We're seeing them in the North Pole as the Arctic sea ice melts and snow cover melts up north. We're seeing them in the South Pole where the glaciers are melting into the sea. We're seeing them in the atmosphere with increased water vapor in the atmosphere and the jet stream becoming more wobbly, creating weather that stays in place for longer. So we're seeing it all over the globe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Bonnie, why this film now?
Well, I want to give a shout out to Barry Hershey, who's on this Zoom, and he's the producer, and he came to us with the idea of feedback loops. He'd been hearing about them a lot from people he was talking to, and then he'd been reading about them and hearing about them, and he did sort of an informal survey with people and found out that a lot of people didn't know about them. A lot of people hadn't heard about feedback loops. They knew about climate change and global warming, but they had never heard about feedback loops. And so he felt like that it was really important to get the message out about what these are and how they're exacerbating the warming that's already happening. So it was very excellent timing on his part, because it really has of late become more part of the conversation, especially with Greta Thunberg in her speeches talking about them. And we're really beginning to see more media coverage about them lately.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What was your goal as you put this together?
I think the goal was just to educate as many people as possible about feedback loops. And that's why we decided to create 5 short films and put them up for free on a website and encourage teachers to use them. We're actually having a webinar on Tuesday for science teachers to learn about how to use the films and the curriculum that was created for them. We were lucky to make a broadcast version that aired on PBS in December. And it's being sold around the world.
Mm-hmm.
So we're really just trying to educate people, because one of the things that every scientist said is you have to talk about it, you have to educate yourself, you have to learn about what's going on, and then you have the tools to do something about it, to be an activist. So this is our part in trying to get the message out and educating people about what's going on.
And how long, when did you create the films? How long have they been out now?
So we finished the films at the end of 2020, and we had a wonderful launch event in January of 2021, where we brought the Dalai Lama and Greta Thunberg together in a virtual conversation with some climate scientists and showed clips of our film, which was really exciting. So that was our official launch. And since then we've been doing, a ton of outreach. We were lucky to show it at COP26 at the invitation of Prince Charles. We showed it to members of the UK Parliament before that, people who were going to COP and wanted to educate themselves on feedback loops. We've been doing all kinds of outreach events and really just trying to get the word out.
And it sounds like you're doing that globally as well. Yeah.
We're trying.
Yeah. Yeah. What kind of impact are you seeing from the films?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, a lot of people watched it. I know that after it aired in December, the Woodwell Climate Research Center, which if you've noticed, we feature a bunch of scientists from that research center because it's a wonderful world-renowned climate center in our backyard in Woods Hole. They got a lot of calls and they got a lot of, they saw a big spike in their donations. So that was a great impact to be supporting the climate scientists. And also the Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a wonderful group that works directly with legislators, their phones lit up after it aired and people wanted to host screenings for their chapters around the country. So we're just seeing a great ripple effect where a lot of people are eager to show it to their constituents and help spread the word out about them.
That's great. I was wondering if it was, you know, people taking it to the legislators or people in government taking it to their constituents. It sounds like it's a little bit of both.
A little bit of both. We are trying to reach more legislators, and we're hoping that through the Citizens Climate Lobby, we can have a better shot of that. But we are hoping, you know, we're still trying to get it into the hands of legislators who can actually make a difference.
It sounds like that's your ultimate goal, right? Is to reach the people who can make those broad scale.
Yeah, I'd say that's one of our goals. And the other is to educate the next generation to make sure that they're learning about this in their curriculum at school. And so it's just part of what they're learning about science and the earth, so they can integrate it and become activists themselves. So it's both, yeah.
Good. Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's riveting. And for me, I have to admit, I was one of those people who had heard the words, but I had not really paid a lot of attention to it. And watching that film just really gave me such a sense of urgency. So,
thank you.
Yeah, great. Brian, so if we want to talk about getting to making change, not at the individual level, i.e. I turn my house down 1 degree, but, you know, at a broader scale, Bonnie, as you were saying, you know, Brian, I think one of the things that you can really help us understand is how can we do that in the community in which we live. It's hard to imagine how to impact, you know, politicians across the globe, although of course we do need global cooperation. It's hard to even imagine doing it in the US, but I think a lot of us can imagine having the ability to influence decision makers, lawmakers, et cetera, in our little village, in our little corner of the world. So Brian, I thought you'd be wonderful if you could talk a little bit about or share with us some examples of how residents like you and others in WFCC or elsewhere have really been able to work with our city. And that, in my mind, includes both the administrative side as well as the legislative side to make change happen at the municipal level.
Sure, and I think it's a really good way of framing it because you know, you're talking about working on the local level to feel sort of a sort of immediate impact. I think a lot of people joined WFCC, and I believe it was actually sort of formed because of sort of a desire to get stuff done on a local level, because there was a frustration that things really weren't able to be done on a federal and to some degree state level. So, you know, I would just say, you know, maybe to give some examples of things that have happened in the past that, you know, I would also say to sort of frame this, you mentioned also administrative and legislative, and I would say that those are two ways to look at it. And we've, you know, broadly speaking, the environmental community has tried to work with both the administration and also on a legislative level. I would also say that there's sort of a kind of like an inside and an outside game, although it's probably more realistic to say there's an outside and a slightly more outside game that we play. And those two roles are sort of, broadly speaking, WFCC, Watertown Faces Climate Change, the 350 node, and Watertown Environment and Energy Efficiency Committee, which is the official town appointed committee, which has a little bit more of an official role. And so it has the capacity to work a little more closely with the administration. Having said that, it's still not the administration, it's still not the legislative part of the town, but it does have a little bit more, I don't want to quite say gravitas, but it does have a little bit more ability to work directly with the administration in some ways. So again, that kind of helps frame, I think, the way that things work, so that WFCC has a little bit more of an ability to do direct advocacy in a way that WE3C tries to work a little bit more sort of nuts and bolts
Mhm.
on issues. And I think that works really well in a complementary sort of way. So if people are looking at ways to get involved, if you want to do advocacy stuff, WFCC is a great way of doing that. WE3C is a much better way of sort of getting into, you know, like you say, you want to write an ordinance. It's generally, and that's not even quite true, because WFCC has been very involved in writing ordinances as well. But sort of a general way of dividing it, that's a way of dividing that stuff. So if I'm not going a little bit too over, if I could just maybe talk a
No,
little bit about some of the initiatives that we've done, or if you want to ask.
Yeah, I think it'd be great to hear kind of the things you have been able to accomplish, and maybe take one with an example where both on the inside side and on the outside side, roles were played that helped us get to a good place. Because I feel like, as a relatively new person to Watertown, you know, you think about the solar ordinance or the 3 net zero schools, and it's kind of astonishingly amazing. To me, it's amazing what we've been able to accomplish. You, everybody here, but how? Like, how do we get that done? Because there's more places for that work to happen, right?
Yep. And, you know, so a number of things that have happened just in recent history. The solar ordinance that was passed that requires solar to be placed on any large commercial or residential building. The LEED ordinance that requires any large commercial building to be LEED certifiable. The net zero, the schools that the 2 elementary schools that have been built to net zero standards, and the high school, which is being designed and expected to be built to a net zero standard. The Solarize program, which was a program to get solar on a number of houses, and the sort of follow-up program of neighborhood solar that was done. These are all programs where it's really hard to sort of draw a line. As I said, W3C is sort of, you know, in theory, the inside game, and WFCC is sort of the outside game, but there's a lot of overlap between both the people and the work that's done between those groups. And so it's hard to draw a bright line between them. But again, generally speaking, like for instance, with the net zero schools, W3C very early on wrote an official guidance from that committee saying what we expected for the schools in terms of net zero and also environmental policies. And WFCC then advocated very strongly for those issues to be put in place. The solar ordinance kind of worked almost in reverse, where it was initially put forth by WFCC, and the town really wanted it to come from an official body, so it was sent through WE3C. So it's sort of, we kind of work through the town the way that works best for any given issue. And again, it can be complicated, but I think that really it's that combination of sort of advocacy, which really has to push the city council now to get these things done. And W3C has again sort of played this role of being sort of the inside, kind of talking to the administration, and sort of being a little bit more wonky about some of this stuff.
Do you think that, I'm just thinking about friends in other municipalities, and you mentioned the word wonky. So I'm not a scientist. I'm not sure that I could, I guess I'm wondering how much for municipalities that have these, like the equivalent of WE3C, what if you're in a group that doesn't have that kind of resource, that kind of intellectual capability, right? We live in Watertown. We have so many universities and schools around us. We have a very Massachusetts is a highly populated education. We've got a lot of really great and very knowledgeable people, and people who will dig in to learn and continue to, you know, be on the cutting edge. Thoughts on like cities that don't have that richness of capacity?
Well, I mean, Watertown is really blessed to have that capacity, you know, being so close to Boston and Cambridge with, you know, MIT and Harvard and the amazing resources we have. But having said that, I don't know how many like professors we have on WE3C. I think it's much more, I'm an engineer. I think it's much more people who are dealing with administrative issues, the kind of people who could write an ordinance. Than when I say wonky, it's not pie in the sky scientific stuff. It's very much practical stuff. So I don't think, and we're looking for people for W3C. We're not looking for scientists, although they're welcome. We're looking for people who can get stuff done. But again, it's more like the kind of thing where you could write an ordinance, you could do something wonky in that sense, but not necessarily, write a thesis or anything deep scientific.
That's helpful. That's really helpful. And so many plugs are being made tonight. The plug there is we need folks for WE3C. Are there particular
and WFCC?
And well, WFCC goes without saying, of course,
Yeah.
we're trying to recruit you in, but for WE3C, are there particular skills that would enrich? And I know Jean is here, who's the chair, but are there particular skills or areas that you would like to just mention or not necessarily?
Again, my feeling about this is we just need people who are willing to get stuff done.
Yep.
You don't need to be an expert to be on WE3C. Like I said, it's kind of wonky, but wonky doesn't mean scientific expertise. It means you're willing to write a letter to the town that is specific about what we need, and some level of knowledge. Like, could you explain what a heat pump does? But not, like reading an article about it. That's sort of at a scientific paper written in a Wall Street Journal or New York Times kind of level of understanding a heat pump, not understanding it from the level of, again, a scientist.
Great. When you think about the coming year to 2 years, what are the priorities that WFCC and or WE3C and or other activists where should we be focusing our energies when it comes to getting our municipality, our city to make change?
So I'm biased. I really see this through a lens of the climate action plan that is just being finalized. And it may be that I'm missing things because of that, but I think a large amount of the work that we need to get done is going to funnel through that climate action plan. It's very broad. And so the climate action plan is going to be finalized within the next few weeks, actually, and be sent to the city council for approval, probably in April-ish. So I think what we're really looking for is getting people to sort of lobby the city council to get this approved. Hopefully it won't be an issue, but we really want to see support for the city council to approve this and not weaken it. Secondly, to get resources to implement the plan, because it's going to take both financial resources, it will take personnel resources, which is partly financial resources, but it'll also take focus of the town. So writing ordinances to get this stuff done. And so the plan is a plan, but to me, I see the plan as a tool. And the plan could be something that's just put on a shelf and never actually done with. What we really need to do is continue to push, once that plan is done, for these things to actually get implemented. So there's a list of things that Watertown Faces Climate Change is coming up with as a priority for the next 12 to 24 months that we really want to see get executed on. And I could kind of give a list of those if that's useful to give people a sense of kind of what, and this is sort of in draft form, and this is sort of my version of this. I could give you a sense of kind of what we're kind of looking at over the next year to 2 years.
I mean, is it like 5 bullets or 25 bullets? You know what I mean? I'd actually like to hear it, but
yeah, no, it's 5. It's 5-ish.
Yeah, go for it.
So there's a net zero building code ordinance. There's an improved solar ordinance. So to right now, it's only for large buildings. We want to increase that to all buildings, and some other improvements to it. Getting off of gas, and that's a broad thing. So getting rid of natural gas altogether, but that's sort of a broad topic. Getting financial programs in the town to support these programs. So using penalties and fees from other programs to fund energy efficiency and conservation programs. Getting people to switch to heat pumps, so then includes both outreach and the financial wherewithal for people to do that. A really robust transportation plan, which needs to be developed. A really short-term thing for transportation, I know Ernest is going to really love this, is the on-demand ride service. And a tree ordinance, which is being developed right now by W3C and should be actually being sent to the city council within the next month or so. And then the last thing I would just say is looking at development, and we're getting so much development right now, and looking at a way to minimize the energy impact of the development that's going forward.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Thanks. We may come back to some of those when we get to Q&A. Let me now turn to you, Steve. May I call you Steve? Steve?
Always.
Oh, good. I don't know you as long as Tony, but I know you well. So, all right, great. Well, so Steve, we've been talking about what we can do at the municipal level, which does feel to me like a thing we can touch and put our arms around. But the broader the landscape, the broader the impact. So when we go from city to state or the Commonwealth, I guess my first question for you would be, what are some examples of just people like us successfully impacting the state's legislative priorities and agenda? Like what we're, and for those that have been successful, how did they achieve that? What works well? What gives us power when we're dealing with you?
So first I want to just point out one thing, and this just to go back to the first part of that question. Yeah, it feels like in the city we can kind of get our hands around. We know the players. We can kind of get our hands around trying to get a not just a response, but like actually have impact on what's going into the town. And things like the solar ordinance that didn't come because the city, the then town council, wanted a solar ordinance. I mean, it kind of came about through the work of everybody here and the help of the town and the administration and the council and folks like that. But what I really want to say is, being in the legislature and as a relatively new person, my colleagues talk about the Watertown solar ordinance. My colleagues come up to me and say, how did you build net zero energy schools? How do you have a net zero energy high school without an override? Like they come to me and say, like, how are you doing, Steve? How are you doing this? This is amazing. Watertown is doing these incredible things. And, frankly, that's because of the work of the people on this Zoom, as much as anybody else, and with cooperation, of course, of the administration and folks, like Laurel and the former town manager and even the current town management and the council. But the work here we do echoes throughout the state. So don't think that we're just a dinky little Watertown, 35,000 people and 4 square miles. We can't really have an impact, because you really have an impact. And that's one thing that I really didn't know, 2 years ago, before I got into the legislature, how much what we do here spreads throughout the state. So folks like, when Watertown folks have Cambridge city councilors coming up to us and saying, like, how the heck did you make that happen? Like, that's really important. I mean, everybody thinks Cambridge is this, like, super progressive, very liberal, very climate focused thing, but they're coming to us. They're saying, how did you get that solar ordinance stuff? So I just want to be really, really clear that, yeah, we feel like we're just making a tiny difference in our little, 4 square miles, but those echoes, man, they're big, and they matter. And, if we do it and, then Cambridge or Medford or Brookline or Newton or Belmont, they start doing these sorts of things, and it spreads. Now, maybe it's not as fast as we want. And that brings me kind of to my second point, because Deb brought up ISO New England. And if you're not familiar with ISO New England, they're basically the electricity broker for the entire Northeast. I'm going to put their website on the in the chat.
Oh, good.
Because one thing that they can do, what they do, is they give you the spread right now of what is generating our electricity right this very second. I think it updates every less than a minute. Right now, 53% of our electricity is being generated by natural gas. 53%.
Wow.
Okay, that's the scale of the problem that we're dealing with. 28% nuclear right now. Okay, now nuclear doesn't really have the same climate impacts, but it has other impacts, I think, as we all know. I mean, for renewables, 8% of our electricity being generated right now is by renewable sources. And ISO New England, what do they consider renewable? Well, wind, okay, half of that 8%, so 4% is wind right now. The rest, burning wood and burning trash. I mean, it's renewable, I guess, because you can grow more wood, and we certainly never run out of trash. But I would not consider those clean, green sources of energy for sure. So, Deb brought up ISO New England. Well, it's nighttime, Eric, so solar is negligible right now. So yes, that's up to the minute. Now, we are working on. There's actually a fun. If you're a nerd, it's fun. If you're a wonk, it's fun. But there's a company in Somerville that's trying to make long-term batteries that get their energy by rusting and unrusting iron. So they don't have to dig up like lithium and like rare earth elements and like things like that, but they can do it with iron. And they're doing this in Somerville, and they brought us over there. It's a really cool operation that they've got, and like cross our fingers that we can generate long-term battery electric storage from clean green sources like solar and wind, just by rusting and unrusting iron rather than like digging up rare earth elements that only occur in certain parts of the world. But yeah, again, Pam, so yeah, you're right, Pam. Home solar doesn't necessarily get into the system because that's powering your home, but still those numbers are from right now, and it's daylight savings, we're trying, we're trying to get that, but it's still 8 o'clock in March, so it's still, we're not we don't have any solar right now. So solar is less than 1% of our current generation. So that's kind of one. So my 2 points there was one, what we do here really matters. Yep. Because people notice, and it's really important that we act locally. Act locally, think globally. That I've seen it work. 2, the scale of the problem is very big, and it's big in a way that we really kind of need to not feel despair, but feel like, okay, we need to keep moving. This isn't necessarily going to be solved by by everybody putting solar panels on on a roof. This is going to be solved by everybody working together to replace that 53% of our electric grid for natural gas with something else. And what we want is that something else to be wind. We want it to be solar. You could make an argument about nuclear. I'm not going to debate that, but I have my opinions. I'm sure everybody here does. And then when the wind's not blowing and when the sun's not shining, that's going to be some sort of storage, whether it's storage in pumped hydro, which is very interesting. You use when the sun's shining, you pump water up, and then when it's not shining, you let it fall down. Potential energy turned to kinetic energy. Physics 101, right? Or if it's some kind of battery, whether it's lithium batteries or these new battery technologies that get stored. So that's what we want. That's where we want to get. We've got a long way to go.
Mm-hmm.
The
Okay,
legislature has done some good things so far, right? So we did the climate roadmap bill. We did that last year now, almost a year ago. Well, the previous legislature did it. The governor kind of pocket vetoed it. He didn't sign it, so it expired. The new legislature, which I am a part of, voted on it. The governor actually vetoed it, and we passed it over his veto. So when you ask again, what can people do? What can, us Watertown citizens do? Well, the current governor has decided he does not want to be governor anymore. And I'm going to be a little bit partisan, so please forgive me. We need to make sure that the next governor isn't going to veto a climate legislation, right? We need to make sure that the next governor isn't going to give us as I mentioned before, a net zero stretch code where net zero is a euphemism, right? We need to make sure that he or she gives us a net zero stretch code that actually gets us to net zero. We need to make sure that the next governor actually believes in these things, won't be beholden to the business lobby who has, or to the real estate lobby who basically has said, we think it's going to be too expensive to limit gas hookups, so don't do it. And we need somebody who will not listen to them and say, no, we just signed a law that says no new fossil fuels by 2050. If we have new gas hookups now, well, how do we make that happen? So I would say, what can we do now? We need a governor who believes in these things. It makes it a lot easier. In terms of what have people done to move the needle forward on statewide climate legislation, that's the only way it moves. It doesn't move because legislators really want it to. I mean, sure, we might want to, but inertia is the default for every legislation. So the only way anything happens is if legislators hear from their constituents and they know that this is important to them. And that's true whether it's climate, whether it's voting rights, whether it's anything. And if you are a legislator who doesn't listen to your constituents, that's one way to be a legislator, I guess, but that's not the kind of legislator I want to be in. And some of those folks don't get to stay legislators very long if they do that. So I hope that answers a little bit of your question, but that's kind of where I wanted to go with this.
Yeah, that's terrific. It's very, very helpful. Before we open up to questions to the audience, what about the national level? Like what about the Green New Deal? Are we going to get there? How are we going to get there? What are your thoughts on that? So
I think there's two issues with the politics at the national level. One is it has just become so polarized that it is going to be extremely difficult to, at this moment in time, to get any sort of big climate legislation, unless even if you live in West Virginia and are pushing the senator there, it still seems like a big heavy lift. So my hope is that we get some of the Build Back Better, the President Biden's Build Back Better agenda through, which will help. The partisan split of the Senate makes it very difficult for us to get really anything through that doesn't have the blessing of the senator from West Virginia, which is kind of an unfortunate situation that we find ourselves in. If you are willing to get involved nationally in places where you don't live, Pennsylvania is a good place to push a Senate candidate that maybe believes in climate change. I'm sure there's others that I just can't think of off the top of my head. I think if the president had a more robust majority in the Senate, there might be some more things that we could push forward. But that's not the world we live in right now. So the action is all happening at the state level. And the House just passed a big offshore wind bill. Hopefully the Senate takes action on that. The offshore wind bill really puts us in a position to really get so much more of our electricity via wind and chip away at that 53% of natural gas. We have the capacity So if you watch the State of the Union address, President Biden announced that we have the capacity for, I think, 30 gigawatts of offshore wind as a nation. 1/3 of that, 10 gigawatts, is off the coast of Massachusetts.
Wow.
So we could power our entire state, several times over, if we recognize that capacity. Now, of course, there's competing interests, right? We can't just fill the sea with wind turbines, but we can really make a huge difference with offshore winds. We can be the Saudi Arabia of offshore wind, which is something that I don't really like, that euphemism, that metaphor, but we could. So we're working for, I believe that the House will and the Senate will do another climate bill before the end of the year. I've learned not to make promises, but I'm almost certain that there will be some kind of climate bill in Massachusetts, and I think other states, California, even Virginia, some of the bluer states, New York, they're pushing this. They're pushing wind, they're pushing renewables, they're pushing targets that are enforceable. And I think that's really where the action is going to be, at least until we roll the dice on the midterm elections.
Great. Well, you've had a couple of numbers tonight that have really blown my socks off. I had no idea that so much of our stuff came from gas. I mean, we have the option in Watertown to do 100% renewable, which is a wonderful, wonderful thing that I'm grateful to have that in the city. But still at the state level, that's shocking. Okay.
Yeah, that's region wide, that's New England.
It's region wide.
Just so,
Got
yeah,
it. Yeah.
to be clear, that's not just Massachusetts.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, thank you so much, all three of you. I appreciate it. I want to open it up to questions now from our guests and the audience. So if you've got a question, please raise your hand. I'll try to keep track as you raise them so that we can kind of respect that. Anybody? Connie.
This is a wonderful meeting to be a part of. Thank you all. I have a question for Steve about the bill that's coming up, I think this Friday. I think it's HH 447, which would ban new gas and oil with new construction statewide. Whether I was going to give you a call and ask whether you're co-sponsoring it, but as long as you're here, I might ask your comments about that bill.
So I haven't co-sponsored that particular bill. That was a late file from Rep. Kay Khan. I've looked it over. That bill is in front of my committee, the Telecom, Utilities and Energy. So usually I don't co-sponsor the bills that I'm about to hear, and I wait until the hearing happens. And that's the hearing that's happening Friday. So we will have an opportunity to either move it forward or not. And I'm looking forward to going through all the testimony on that bill. I think, again, like I said, we've set a target to be carbon neutral, to be net zero by 2050, right? If you're building any facility that is going to last beyond 2050 and you are using you're using fossil fuels to heat it or to cool it or to cook for cooking for your hot water, that's a big problem, because we've already committed that you're going to have to change that out before 2050. So it's really important that we set those targets now. Yeah, lock. You can't really, if you're locking in that carbon usage, it's going to be really, really hard to offset that. In 2050, it seems like a long time away. It's not that long away when you really think about it, and particularly with the amount